So, David, I was listening to a podcast you did a while ago, probably a year or so ago, and you mentioned that, like, if you'd need to come up with any people in the world to invite to a dinner party, you mentioned David Bowie and Ezra Klein and other people. Can you talk about like why these people, especially like David Bowie?
Yeah, I mean, David Bowie, I think what's interesting, I mean, there's a million interesting things about David Bowie. He's one of the most interesting people, I think, is I picked him because obviously a great artist, and, amazing musician, but also just if you listen to some of the things that he said about technology going back, decades, he was there were some of these things were quite prophetic. When he was interviewed very, very early about when people were like, oh, is this internet thing, is this just like a fad or whatever? And the way that he was able to see into the future and the impact and the creative potential, the disruptive potential of this very nascent technology, it was amazing. And I think, like, I guess it connects to me as to, like, one of the reasons I'm in the games industry is,
Mm.
the games industry, fundamentally, we're in the business of, it's a creative industry, of course, but it's also a technology industry. It's about using technology to create these new worlds and these new experiences. And I think in Silicon Valley particularly, there's this sort of false line that is often drawn between technical people and non-technical people, and usually the sort of underlying message is the technical people are the serious ones, and everyone else is sort of slightly wasting their time. And I actually think that the most interesting people have both, because they realize there's so much interplay between the two of them.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Like I'm thinking myself, like think about like when I got into games, it felt so like even making like some black and white mobile phone games was like amazing to do, because it felt like, okay, this like technological piece that I put in my pocket and I can play games with it. I can create games on it. So you're even like you're consuming, but you're also creating. It was like the most amazing thing, to be honest.
It's funny you say that, because the games, still, if I had to pick one game in the entire, like, that I've played in my entire life that had the most profound impact on me, and as both a player and ultimately in my career, it was a game I remember very clearly. It was 1993. I was walking around the Computer Shopper show with my dad, who'd taken me there, and I walked past a stand that was just a bunch of these monochrome computers that just had text. There was a whole bunch of them, and there was just text on them, and there were all these people sitting down, and I was just like, what the hell is this? And so
Yeah.
I walked over, and it was a mud called Avalon. And what they had done, and this was pre-internet, so they used to run this game through on a bunch of modems, and it was started by a couple of guys, one of whom is actually still a friend, Daniel, an entrepreneur called Daniel James, who now lives in San Francisco. And I sat down and I sort of was asking, what is this? And like, well, it's a game. You play it with text, but you play it with other people, and this is, again, like, multiplayer. Now it sounds so funny. This dates me, I suppose, but the idea of virtual environments and with where you're interacting with other people, at the time, that was not something that really was happening very much. Actually, I think it was 1992. And so I sat down and I'm like, I'm playing this game, and I'm kind of walking around, and then the light bulb moment for us. So I walk around, I come to this sort of clearing. There's a bunch of people sitting around a fire just chatting, and I'm starting to chat with them too. And even that was like, wow, I'm like chatting to these other people. And then in comes this guy riding a white dragon, And I still remember this very, very clearly. And he comes in and he didn't say anything. He just was, I guess, just passing through, and he sort of swoops in on this white dragon. The text is describing this, and then he leaves and flies away. And at that moment, I was like, I want whatever. I don't know how that guy did that, but I want to do that. And it turns out, and so like that really was such a light bulb moment for me. And I think also, like, I took a lot of lessons, a lot of lessons about game design. I think now looking back, you can really draw from that, which is, the most powerful, what a moment that was. And the most powerful, we're so advanced now in thinking about like what are these extrinsic motivators. There's so many frameworks now around metagame and all these terms, but the power of an intrinsic of engaging someone's imagination to the degree where they set their own goal for what they want to accomplish in your world, and that is the most powerful thing. And and that set me on a path for that game. I started playing that game a lot. It's a kind of product of a misspent youth, and then it's also the game where I met my first business partner, a guy called Matt Mahaley, and then we ended up starting a company together, making our own text muds in the 90s. And anyway, I'm rambling, but it's just it's so funny that a kind of something so unassuming, on the surface, you can do so much. It's not always about, polish and graphics and engagement. There's you can deliver so much if you can engage people's imaginations.
Yeah, for sure. Like in that moment, you started working on games as well with your first company, Iron Realms. Can you talk a bit about like what an average day looked like when you were making games in Iron Realms?
Well, an average day was I would go to school because I was a high school student. So my average day was it was a little weird situation because it was in my final year of high school, and I had applied to Oxford, and I was very lucky because it was the final year where you could go, and they had their own exam, and if you took their exam and you passed their interview, then your final grades at the time, they were A levels. I'm not sure what it is now, but they were A levels, and they didn't really matter. Like you could get whatever final grades you wanted. You knew you had a place there because you had passed their exam already. And me being the kind of person that I am, I was like, all right, great. Well, I don't really care about my exams anymore. I'm going to work. And I met my founder, as I say, on this game. And he's like, I want to make a game. I think we could make it better than this game for X, Y, and Z reasons. And they were it was this very, very like, stupid reasons initially. And so I would go to school and I would come home and do the bare minimum I needed to do on my homework. And then I would stay up, usually quite late. And I think my parents were like, why are our phone bills so high? Because at the time, it was charging by the minute, anyway. So I did that, and I worked away in sort of in secret, and eventually it sort of came out that I was doing this. But that was it's not a very standard working day. I was still a kid.
Yeah. Was it like how many games did you make like during that period of the high school years? How was it?
That was just the one game, right? Because we were building really with a very, very small team. I think initially it was just me and Matt, and Matt was also a designer and also was programming. I mean, that's the great thing about text games, right? Is like you can create an enormous amount of content and systems without needing like a huge team of people, right? Yeah, so it was all about for a long time. It was just about our first game, which is a game called Akea. It's still live, by the way. Akea, go to ironrealms.com. We have, I think, we have a bunch of games now, four or five. I mean, I haven't been involved for years and years and years, but it was just the one game, and I was designing the skill system. So like one of the hallmarks of both the game that we used to play and our game was this very deep combat system. So if you choose depending on what career you chose, you had skills that were, you know, just incredibly intricate, and so much of it was very PvP oriented. And so I was sort of designing those, just writing design documents that would then get, you know, we'd then play.
Nice. Yeah. My high school days was, I was creating games as well, but I was doing them alone. So you at least had a co-founder. Oh man, so cool to hear those.
And also, I suppose
Yeah.
the other thing was it was the first in a long line of remote collaborations. It's funny. I mean, obviously, so after high school, I took a year. I took a year out, and I spent half of that year in China teaching English. And so this is so this is, by the way, this is of 1996 now. So 90, you know, early 90s when I first started playing that game. And so we were still working on the game, and so we were trying to, I guess, you know, you would call it remote work or distributed team now, but obviously like way pre Zoom or anything. And so like we used to, and so the way that we would do this was I would like write my designs on paper, and then there was a university, and so I was in Hangzhou, China, which was like a, you know, tier two city. And I found the way I could get, the only place you could get internet was, this is like China in like 1996, is you go to the university. And I went and made friends with like the university administrator, and they had like one machine that connected to the internet. And so I would like type up all of my designs, and then there was another, and you know, and email them basically. And then there was this other mud where we would meet, and it was like this ice cavern where we would have, like, that was where we would go, and like we would talk about whatever we needed to talk about like once or twice a week, because it was like the other side of town. And like that was that it was, that was how we built the game together.
Yeah.
You know, during that year. And then I became less, and once I was at university, you know, with, you know, everything else that was going on, I sort of started to become less involved. But you know, the company is still around, and you know, the really interesting about that company is we were we went, so we launched the game, and we had, you know, quite a small player base, and this was at the tail end of when you could still charge by the minute for things. You know, there were these online services where you could charge people by the minute, but that was coming to an end, and we were trying to figure out what the hell we were going to do, because we didn't have a player base that was big enough that, you know, we could just charge a subscription. You know, the other model that was predominant at the time was a you know, monthly subscription, and there just weren't enough people that would be, you know, viable. And so my partner had, what was in hindsight a brilliant idea. I credit him 100% with this. This is Matt Mahaley. We created a bunch of items, unique virtual items, and then to sell. And these were obviously not cosmetic, because it was a text-based game. Like these did stuff. Like we had like I don't know, like a magic wand that teleported you around the place, and like, you know, it was like really interesting stuff. And like one of them was just like a custom house that you could have in the world, and we would just put it in. You could write it, and we would put it in the world. All these things, and then we had no idea how to price them, and so we held an in-game auction, like a live, literally, like, you know, going once, going twice, you know, people submitting their bids live, and auctioned them off. And some of these items went for thousands of dollars. And that was a real, I mean, again, talk about a light bulb moment. My God, like, and that became our business. So we're like, okay, this game, we're not going to charge people to play this game, but we're going to have an item shop, and we're going to sell virtual items to our players, and other kinds of progression oriented things. And that was in, you know, 96, 97. So we were definitely one of the first, certainly in the West, one of the first free to play game, you know, companies. Yeah. So I think that's the other really interesting thing about, in terms of like impact on my future career. It was like, one, you can just build something and like get users on the internet, and then, you know, make money that way. And like, oh, you can actually do that for yourself as a company,
Yeah.
being as an entrepreneur, and then also just, yeah, this sort of creative, being able to just create and figure out, be creative, not just in terms of content, but also how do you make money off it? And like, that was just, once that bug got into my ear, I was it. Like I was, that was from that point on. So I would say, Daniel James and Matt Mahaley are like probably the two people most responsible for like the path that I took, now.
Yeah, that's a amazing start to a path to do a lot of interesting stuff. Like one thing, I'm sort of jumping around here, but I want to hear the story of Gaming Insiders, which happened a lot later.
Mm.
What was Gaming Insiders? How did it get started? Who was involved?
Yeah. The genesis of that, I suppose the link is, if there's two defining things in my career, it's been like building games and game companies, and then the other was building this early community of founders, Gaming Insiders. And so that was a little bit later. So jumping forward a few years, I had sort of, after I left university, I sort of worked in startups. I'm British, obviously. I was working, for various companies in London. And, I decided to move to California because there wasn't a ton of an entrepreneurial scene, and just California felt like the right place for me. And I'm actually a dual citizen, so I moved over and did some stuff. But the way that the Gaming Insiders came about was I joined a company in, I would say that this is now in 2008, 2007, 2008 kind of period. I think it's 2007, 2008. Joined a company called Meteor Games that was had been started by Adam and Donna Powell, who were at that time best known for being the founders of Neopets, which was really like the first. That was like the first. That was probably the first big gaming exit. Viacom bought their company in the sort of, I think it was the mid 2000s for, I think $150 million or something or thereabouts, which at the time was a massive exit, for a game company.
Yeah.
And then they had started a new company that was trying to build at the time a sort of quite ambitious browser-based MMO, like full 3D. And when I joined, I was sort of, it was clear that they're sort of, it was going to be very hard to build what they wanted to build with the resources that we had and the team that we had and all sorts of stuff. And at the time, I was getting really, really interested in Facebook. And so, well, at the time it was actually MySpace, Facebook, and there were other platforms too. Notably, there was a platform called High Five, which is lost to history now, but it's
I still
actually
get
when I first.
emails from them, by the way.
Are you serious? That still
Yeah.
exists?
Yeah,
That's hilarious.
it is.
That's actually where I first met Andrew Shepard, who now is a GP at Transcend, and has done was at Kabam and all sorts of stuff. But there were some really interesting people at that company.
Was he at
back in,
High Five? Okay,
he
I
was at
didn't
High
know.
Five at the time. Yeah,
That's funny.
yeah, and I think so. Anyway, I'm pretty sure. And
Yeah.
so I joined this company, and I had sort of my pitch when I joined, when I was the first sort of executive hire. I was not a founder of that company, but I was the first sort of executive hire there, and I sort of pitched them on, like, I really think this whole social gaming thing is interesting. Like this platform, look at all the and there's a whole, by the way, there's a whole separate conversation we had about platforms and evil, opportunity, where opportunity comes from in the games industry, and like
Yeah.
we should probably talk about that at some point. But so anyway, long story short, I convinced them to sort of pivot the company and start making social games on both MySpace and Facebook. And we had made a couple of games that didn't really work, and then thanks to some really good some really good intel from a guy called Adam Kaplan, who's also now at VC, but at the time was one of the sort of founders of Super Awards, which was a very early. And by the way, I hope this is okay. I'm giving you the very long versions of my answers here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But he was at the time really like had a great insight into what games were succeeding on the Facebook platform, and so we built a game kind of at my instigation, we built a game called Island Paradise, and it was a very early farming game, and it was success. It was starting to be really successful, but the thing that was missing for me personally was like, I just don't know enough people, other founders who were doing, this was in LA. So I was in LA down with Adam and Donna, and all of the interesting companies that were really pursuing this stuff. It was really a very SF based, cohort of people. And it was, a bunch of entrepreneurs. Many of them were like, I think still at Stanford, like had been starting building, or were building during their sort of, that was just the universe where all this was happening. So I just started it as a mailing list. It was called Social Gaming Insiders at the time. And it was just an email list that was for other founders who were trying to build these gaming companies. And it was very simple. I had a very simple, the job to be done was, I have a bunch of questions about what I should be doing, and I want to talk to, peers. And the general thesis was, we all have more to gain than to lose by talking to each other. And that was how it started. And it, obviously it grew from there, but that was the start.
What would like thinking about like where gaming insider sort of peaked? What did an event look like? What was the crowd over there?
I'm going to answer a different question first, which is, if I think about like what were the key things that made it work as a community that then flowed into what made the, around the events. And the things that made it work were curation was the first thing. Very clear rules around who could, and actually in some ways relaxing some of that later on was actually probably one of the mistakes that I made. But curation of really, initially it was really just founders, right? And for a long time it was really just the founding CEOs and stuff. The second was, I paid very, very close attention to I guess you would call it moderation and community. There were some just decisions I made around the kind of environment of trust that I wanted to cultivate, that meant people were prepared to say things that they might not say on stage at a conference, say. And then the final thing that also really helped was the in-person aspect. So this started, eventually we had conferences and things of that nature, but for a long time we were just doing these dinners. And I think the first dinner was like literally 12 people or so, in a Chinese restaurant called Fang in San Francisco. And which became, we did more stuff there than anywhere else. Big fan of Fang. And that sort of interplay between the trust that you build and the kind of relationships that you build over a glass of wine and some Chinese food, and then that flowing back into then online, it kind of made that more compelling. And those two things combined, I think, were the key to it initially.
Yeah. Did you read the book, this 2-hour cocktail party thing that came out like last year?
No.
Yeah, it's a guy called Nick Ray, who's been like, his Twitter feed is only about cocktail parties, and he created a manual. It's I just read it last year, and I was thinking maybe I could apply it and have an elite game developers evening, like a cocktail party. But what's holding me back is I'm not that person. Sort of. I'm a writer. I do podcasts, but like I'm not sure I'm a party sort of organizer yet, at least.
Look, the large scale events were incredibly stressful, and I would not wish that on anyone. But I would say you can. So I'm a strange personality type. I would describe myself as an outgoing introvert. Like my natural inclination is like it takes energy for me to be around lots of people. But I also, and for me, I kind of enjoy in small doses. I can put on the role, I can play the role of a host, and it was something I kind of enjoyed in in moderation, and at smaller scale. I think there's a hard cap on, when you lose that intimacy, you lose it becomes a different kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good book. Like it's a quick read,
I'll
like
read it.
80 pages. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give it a read.
Yeah. Well, so eventually Gaming Insiders turned into a newsletter, as I recall.
Yes.
More or less. Yeah. And it's not around anymore.
No, I mean, so the kind of the brief history of where Gaming Insiders went. So it grew quite a lot. We ended up having several kind of communities focused around different things. So we had like a growth community that was like, we had a lot of the early, because it became clear. Obviously, this coincided with massive growth in mobile, and then spurred by in-app purchases and free to play and so forth. And so we sort of developed these various communities. We grew. And then I sort of took on an investor who, his heart was in the right place, but for a long time I didn't, and I probably should never have taken outside money for that company in hindsight. But it was as an investor who I spent a good year talking, and he was very keen to get involved, and he had some really good success in the event space as well as in technology. And I was saying no to it for a long time because I was like, I just haven't really figured out what this is as a business yet.
Yeah.
And he's like, look, I really think you could make a top tier events business out of this. And I kind of allowed myself to be convinced to take it in that direction, which in hindsight was like a mistake, probably. I mean, not that, the events were successful. So, we ended up doing a lot of dinners, and we had conferences. And I think, we did 4-5 conferences total. Like we had an annual conference in San Francisco. And they grew and they grew, and eventually ended up selling the company to a larger events company, which in turn was swallowed by an even larger, one of the really big ones like Informa, or one of those. But it lost something in that, scale was antithetical to what made Gaming Insiders valuable. And actually, in hindsight, I probably should have done what you have done with elite game developers, which is just formed a syndicate and around actually just invested in all these fantastic founders that I was meeting. I was doing a lot of the sort of that work but without that piece, which in retrospect was probably a big missed opportunity. I mean, I ended up with some advisory stakes in some early companies like Scopely, but that could have really been a phenomenal investing vehicle opportunity, I guess. But
Yeah.
hindsight is 2020.
Yeah, it
Always.
is. It is. Man, you did more companies in the gaming space in the coming years. You went on to have success with the latest company you built called Snapshot Games, which is now part of Saber Interactive under the Embracer Group. So, like, my question for you is, like, if you'd look at this kind of evolutionary chart of the human being, like going from a chimp to a Homo sapiens, can you describe how your evolutionary chart from going on from Iron Realms to Snapshot Games, what does that look like from the 90s to 2023?
Yeah, I probably was somewhat of a chimp as a teenager. I think like there are some things that the different, and there are some things that have stayed exactly the same, for better or for worse. The stuff that has stayed exactly the same, which again, and I do actually think, depending on how you measure success, which is a whole other question. I think the thing that has remained absolutely consistent is I've been very driven by, I guess, not particularly rational motivations. I guess you could call it passion or interest. But if I think about, Iron Realms was, I want to do that. Like this, I think this is really cool. And like, I can't think of a more interesting thing to do than this. So I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And, all of the things that I've done, all the things I've started particularly, have all had it's been that. So in the case of, jumping forward to Snapshot Games, that again, like the inception of Snapshot Games, actually, that goes back to me as a, like, I don't know, I'm like 11 years old, or actually probably even younger. I had a Z. My first computer was a ZX Spectrum, and then you know, the way that back then, the way you know, there were all these magazines, and there was this, the magazines at the time would they would have a cover tape, literally a cassette tape that was stuck on the front of the magazine, and they had games on it. And one month, the game that was on the front of this magazine was a game called Chaos, that was made by a guy called Julian Gollop, and it was a strategy game. It was a brilliant strategy game. Still is a brilliant strategy game, by the way. I was playing this game. I was like, I loved that game. And then as I sort of, and so, you know, of course, Julian went on to have, you know, quite a storied career in terms of building, you know, creating strategy games. And, you know, when I was in my sort of teens, you know, I was a huge fan of XCOM, or which in the UK was, I think it was called UFO. And so, you know, the start of snapshot games, and as far as like what's changed, I'm talking, going to start talking about snapshot, but I'll tell you what the connecting tissue was. The way that started was, I was just a huge fan of his work, and when I read some blog, you know, random interview to give him to a blog somewhere, that he was going to, you know, set up a new studio. And my sort of observation, having then spent some time in the games industry, I mean, this is like 2013, I think, was Julian was a tremendous creator, but maybe there was an opportunity to help him a little bit on the business side. And so that was really why I reached out to him. And so, as far as like, that's the connecting thing always. It was never a sort of a calculation around what should I do next. Because if I'd been more calculating, maybe I would have just been like, you know what, mobile free to play looks like a big opportunity. I should just pursue that in some capacity. So I think, as far as what's changed, well, I think it's just what happens as you mature and learn a bunch of lessons the hard way from experience.
Yes.
And I think I'm a little bit, I still think I do things for passion, but I think I'm a little bit more mindful of both. I know myself much better, so I think I understand the gaps in my personality, and where my predispositions might lead me astray, or maybe where I'm not thinking about things in the way that I should be. And I'm probably also more mindful of the overall sort of environment within which things play out. So I guess I'm a little bit more calculating, I guess, than I used to be.
Yeah, sort of the relationship to this whole industry of gaming, it's so weird, because like it's so hard to leave, for me at least, feeling like it's the place to be. I'm also worried about becoming cynical at some point about gaming.
Yeah.
But it's like the story about you and Julian hooking up to co-found Snapshot Games. I think that's so brilliant, because it's like totally, like, there's a story there from you playing his games early on, and him having a career in gaming, and you going on to having a career, and then like coming together and building another like thing in this industry. I think that's so amazing that can be done.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, again, it also comes down to you know, it's just funny how things play out. You know, they're about relationships. You know, I think that, yeah, I'm rambling. Probably
yeah,
cut that.
Yeah, it's man, it's totally true. Yeah, that's how the industry works. Like another topic, like which we already like hit upon, was like VC a bit there, mentioning a few names. You've now been spending some time as an investor. What's hard about being an investor in gaming from your perspective?
Oh, also, first of all, I've been an investor for about 5 minutes relative to the rest of my career. So I've like literally no, you know, and that's you know, the tough thing about investing, right? The feedback loops are so long relative to being an entrepreneur. Like, so I don't know if I have any really good lessons. I think the things that are hardest are remembering that the role you play is so different. You have to be quite irrational as a founder in a lot of ways. And I think maybe the biggest challenge is coming at it from having been a founder for so long, is your greatest strength is probably also your greatest weakness, which is you have a tremendous amount of empathy for the founder. And when I say empathy in a very meaning a couple of things, there is the kind of emotional, dimension of just sort of knowing what it's like to be, in their shoes, and what can be a very, very, a real roller coaster. But but I also mean empathy in the very specific sense of your natural inclination is to sort of to think, what would I do if this was my company? And and to sort of, I think it's possible to talk yourself into an investment, which, because you think, well, if we could just do this and this and this could be really successful, right? And that's good in one sense, but you don't have that same level of agency as an investor. You can't do that. You can't have that level of impact. And so I think you have to sort of engage a kind of a second part of your brain, which is a bit more cold and rational, which is like, okay, but in order for this to work out, and you have to be thinking obviously about what could go right, right? Like, that's good. Investors don't just think about, if all you did was spend your time thinking about what the challenges were, you would never make an investment, and you would be a very bad investor. But you also have to be very conscious of the number of, you think about it almost like a funnel, right? Friction in the funnel. Like, okay, all these things that are missing right now have to get fixed in order for this to hit some sort of the next round of funding, and obviously also, like, further, there's like long-term success, but there's also just like the very practical, like, okay, these guys are going to have to raise again in like a very short space of time. What do I think the likelihood is based on the challenges they have right now? And I think that striking that balance is really hard. I think the other thing is also about your relationship with the entrepreneur, because I think in a founder relationship, if you see something that's like a big flashing, red siren, like a big red flag, there's something that's going wrong, my instinct is like, when that's happened at Snapshot, I'm calling Julian like, dude, we gotta talk, we gotta figure this out, like, yesterday. Like, this is a huge problem. And like, and honestly, it's probably a weakness of mine that I can sort of maybe be a little bit overly anxious in certain situations. But I think you have to be a bit more diplomatic maybe when you're talking to a founder, and realize that, you're not a founder, and you have to, not that you shouldn't be candid, but I think it takes a slightly more deft and delicate hand to be effective.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's a sort of like you need to pull yourself out of it and think about the things that, like, from from experience, but then also not being the person who builds or thinks about like building it.
Yes.
But like you said one interesting thing that, like, I think is something I definitely need to spend more time on, is like, because I do look at a pitch, and it's so much about what's not here that I usually want to see. But like, I'm not spending enough time sort of being irrational, using that word, and spending time thinking big with the founder and dreaming where it could go, and just having a discussion about that. I think that's something that came to my mind as you said the word irrational there.
I probably over-index on that. But I sort of, I think to me, the probably the healthiest thing is you sort of want to get excited during the call. And like the other thing I'm noticing is, if you're not excited on the first call, then that's just, you should just probably say no, and that's it. And thanks very much, and wish them luck. But I
Yeah.
think then you probably take a step back after that conversation and think, okay, am I falling in love? What am I falling in love with here? And then am I talking myself into something? I don't know. There's no easy answers as to how do you strike that right balance. I don't think.
Yeah. Like being a founder of 2 companies and then going on a investor path. Like I think I just pick up so much out of working with founders in so many different kind of fields and different kind of personalities. And I think that's also something you do start picking up. But I'm a bit worried about like losing sort of the part of me who is the irrational founder. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what the right mix is, but I think it helps to have, I don't know. We talk about things sometimes, and I think that's one way that you can, that can be really helpful. You can kind of balance each other out a little bit.
That's good. Yeah. Hey, I want to ask you about sort of AI. You've been involved with some of the Web3 stuff, and now we have AI coming big time, or it's here, like crazy times. What is your feeling about like how that is changing gaming and the players, like from the developers' perspective and for the players?
God, that is a huge question. So I think there's like 2 different questions there. Really, like one is sort of about development and like the impact it's going to have there. And then there's the sort of the other question, which is around the kind of the player experience.
Yeah, I think everybody kind of realizes the developer side because it's like everything's just more efficient. But like, what is like, if you try to answer the player side of things, where do you see sort of like those interesting things happening there for the player?
Well, I don't. I think it's early to see that, to see what's going to emerge. But I'll tell you some things that are like a couple of themes that that things I've come across recently that strike me as promising. So, and I sort of want to be careful about I'm going to sound a bit vague maybe, because I don't want to talk too publicly about things that have been disclosed to me that, are proprietary. I want to be respectful of the work that startups are doing.
Yeah.
But I think that, looking at like LLMs, and connecting LLMs to different what kinds of play patterns become possible when you do that. There's one that's getting talked about quite a lot that I'm sort of, I think is a little gimmicky, and I'm not as as excited about, which is, oh look, NPCs are going to, you can just have some random NPC in the tavern can be more realistic, and I think that's fair, like that's reasonable, and like maybe we're coming to the you see that those sort of videos that you see on TikTok and stuff of people doing like live action pretending to be NPC, like a live action Skyrim, and like with the NPCs kind of walking in weird ways and saying the same 3 barks like over and over and over again out of context. And like it's pretty clear to see how like that's going to go away and become something that's a lot more natural, and it's all the pieces are already in place for that to to happen, right? In terms of synthesizing voices that are realistic, and obviously not just saying the same pre-recorded bark over and over and over again. I think that's good, and that's like but that's going to be one of those things, just like improved fidelity in 3D graphic, with the next generation of graphics. It's just going to be one of those things that recedes into the background.
Yeah.
But if you think about like some of the more interesting things that have been happening with these LLMs, and like their capacity to persuade and to lie and make stuff up. And then you think about, there are certain types of games, video games and tabletop kind of board game, kind of real life games, where that is a key part of the gameplay. I think there is some really interesting design space to be explored there. And I won't be any more specific than that, but I know that there are some teams that are doing interesting things with that. The other thing that caught my eye recently, that I think caught a lot of people's attention, was the sort of work that was done with agents, and the idea that you can have these, and I forget, it was an academic team that built a kind of proto Sims like experience, where they had all these NPCs that were really sort of had their own high level goals, and then just they kind of put them in a village together, and one of them was like planning a party, and it was about like who was deciding, and they were kind of lying to each other about, like one of them didn't want to invite this other one, and like was trying to, and there were all these interesting emergent behaviors that they were displaying. And again, I think like that to me, and like we saw a version of the pre AI explosion, like the thing that sticks in my head about like really impactful system was, if you remember those Monolith games, the Shadows, the Mordor, I think the most recent one was called Shadow of War, the other one, the first one, and this Nemesis system, right, where you had these NPCs that sort of ended up, developing, you sort of develop vendettas and things of that nature. That was the kind of version 1.0 version of this, but I think you sprinkle in some of the developments that are happening in AI, and like the idea that you can have characters in the game that are kind of and to me that's actually like, we've done this is an incredibly compelling behavior from games going back decades, but it's been, in fact, actually speaking about like a game I know very well, like XCOM, the original XCOM did an incredible job of making you believe that the aliens, you didn't have perfect information, right? You didn't know what the aliens were doing. You had these UFOs that were kind of coming around the place, and that you weren't even seeing them all the time. If you had like radar in the specific area where they were going through, did you even know that they were there? But what XCOM did in like 1993 or 4 was, it gave you this idea, this very strong sense that they had a plan and they had an agenda. There was this malevolent intelligence that had a plan, and you were seeing parts of it, but there was other stuff happening that you didn't know was going on. And that was an incredibly compelling part of what made that game very special. And makes other games, especially strategy games, very special, Civilization and Galactic Civilizations and, Crusader Kings and all those sorts of games. Like they all do this incredibly great job of giving you the sense that there are other actors in this game that are doing things and have agendas and are plotting. And in the case of, I've talked to Julian about this, about, UFO, and, that was all smoke and mirrors, right? A lot of what, and this is a kind of a real game design hack, is that like randomness is your friend, because human beings we are pattern recognition machines. And so you can have actually, what's going on is just kind of random, but because we are the kind of creatures that we are, we construct stories that explain those actions. And so this is something that's been going on in games for a long time, but the toolkit has been very, blunt because of the, where technology has been. But now we really can actually have, or we soon will be in a place where we actually can have pretty intelligent, entities that can really be doing some of this stuff. And you've got to be very excited about the kinds of experiences that are going to become possible because of that.
Yeah, I think so too. And this is like so early with what the LLMs and all the experiments that are going on. Like, let's see what comes out.
Yes.
Yeah. Some final questions for you, David. What's your favorite book and why?
Oh, I thought when you sent me this question, I was like, this is an impossible question. So I'm not in. If I felt in the same way, I'm gonna give you. I'm just gonna tell you a book I read recently that just has just stuck with me, and this is no way relevant to anything we've discussed at all. But the book, it's like a book that's been on my list for a long time. I was like, oh, I should really read this, but I read it, and God, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which is a I don't know how to talk about this in an intelligent way, but I will just say that it's I guess it's a book about America in a lot of ways, and it's a very dark book. But as someone who I'm my background, I did an English degree, so like my background is although I spend all my time in thinking about technology, I'm still I'm a huge fan of the written word. It's funny that my first game was a text game. It's just real perfect mixing the written word with technology. But like that is a book that just sticks in your head, and the writing is at such a incredible, just incandescent level of writing, which is just amazing.
Mm.
And then I'll give you another book that's maybe a bit more like another book that stuck with me. Just I'm not a fan of business books, really. I think they waffle a huge amount, and there's I haven't gotten a lot of value from it. But the book that has stuck with me from a business perspective that I recommend to everyone I come across, I feel like, especially in the kind of entrepreneurial like founder context, is Seven Powers. By Hamilton Helmer, which I think I became aware of because I'm a big fan of the Acquired podcast, and like they always, as a framework for analyzing where sustainable competitive advantage comes from, and kind of how to a really good taxonomy of the kinds of moats that you can build that both accrue to companies at scale, as well as how you can build a moat as a startup coming into a new category. I think that's just been such a powerful, the ideas in that book have been so powerful for me as I think about why certain kinds of companies become incredibly successful, that I just constantly find myself recommending that to every founder that I come across.
Yeah, it's a good one. I remember reading it a few years ago and sort of go back to those powers that are mentioned.
Yes.
Do you have a story that shaped you in how you approach your work today?
Oh God, I mean, I feel like I've given, we've talked about many of most of them in the course of this conversation. To be honest with you, um, yeah, I don't know. Again, I think the thing I would just leave it with is this isn't a story at all, but I think the unifying thread with all this is just, I think the biggest gift that you can have, like a single personal trait gift you can have, is curiosity. And I think like if you cultivate curiosity and you follow it, you always end up in interesting places. And I think if there's like one key to every story that I've told, it's always that it's about following your curiosity to all of the strange places that it can take you.
Yeah, even when you think it's a dead end, usually you've picked up like interesting things along the way, and then you continue another path which is sort of couldn't exist if you wouldn't have taken the interesting path earlier
Yeah,
on.
and I think dead ends. I think a dead end is always about stepping back. It's about dead ends are sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? Like if you can take I think that's one thing I probably have. If I'm getting better at anything in my career, it's probably there's a time for tunnel vision and focus, and then there's a time for kind of zooming out and just taking looking at things from another perspective. And there's a role for both.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, well said. Man, last question. So you're on LinkedIn and Twitter and places like that. I believe you have a Substack as well.
I have a Substack, but I've written one article, so I feel a bit
Okay.
weird directing people to it. I wrote something
Yeah.
a year ago. I'm going to start writing some more.
Yeah.
I probably should have come into this knowing where that was going to be, but you can follow me on Twitter. I don't tweet very much either. I'm like one of the I think I've been on Twitter since 2007, and I've got like 100. I've like tweeted like 100 times.
Okay.
But you can follow me at David. I'm basically David at David Kaye everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn. Well, not ats on LinkedIn. But you know what? I'll give you the Substack because maybe this will prompt me to actually write something else there.
Mm.
So I think it's gamestuff.substack.com, which is which is a tribute to my favorite newsletter, which is Matt Levine's Money Stuff. He's a brilliant writer. So yeah, okay, gamestuff.substack.com, and I'll try and write something else.
Yeah, let's do that, man. All right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, David. Have a good day, man, and speak soon.
Cheers, Joachim.
Bye.